Chapter 1, Part 1, A Famous American Statesman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. Famous American Statesman by Sarah Knowles Bolton. George Washington, Part 1. The purest figure in history, wrote William E. Gladstone of George Washington. When Frederick the Great sent his portrait to Washington, he sent it with these remarkable words: "From the oldest general in Europe to the greatest general in the world." Lord Brougham said, "It will be the duty of the historian and the sage of all nations to let no occasion pass of commemorating this illustrious man, and until time shall be no more, will a test of the progress which our race has made in wisdom and virtue be derived from the veneration paid to the immortal name of Washington." At Bridges Creek, Maryland, in a substantial home overlooking the Potomac, George Washington was born, February 22, 1732. His father, Augustine, was descended from a distinguished family in England, William D. Hertburn, a knight who owned the village of Wessington, Washington. He married at the age of 21 Jane Butler, who died 13 years afterward. 2 years after her death he married Mary Ball, a beautiful girl, of decided character and sterling common sense. She became a good mother to his 2 motherless children, 2 having died in early childhood. 6 children were born to them, George being the eldest. The opportunities for education in the New World, especially on a plantation, were limited. From one of his father's tenants, the sexton of the parish, George learned to read, write, and cipher. He was fond of military things, and organized among the scholars sham fights and parades, taking the position usually of commander-in-chief by common consent. This love of war might have come through the influence of his half-brother Lawrence, who had been in battles in the West Indies. When George was 12, his father died suddenly, leaving Mary Ball, at 37, to care for her own 5 children, 1 having died in infancy, and 2 boys by the first marriage. Fortunately, a large estate was left them, which she was to control till they became of age. While she loved her children tenderly, she exacted the most complete obedience. She was dignified and firm, yet cheerful, and possessed an unusually sweet voice. To his mother's intelligence and moral training, George attributed his success in life. She would gather her children about her daily, and read to them from Matthew Hale's Contemplations Divine and Moral. The book had been loved by the first wife, who wrote in it Jane Washington. Under this, George's mother wrote, and Mary Washington. This book was always preserved with tender care at Mount Vernon in later years. Such teaching the boy never forgot. When he was 13 he wrote Rules of Courtesy and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation, 110 maxims, which seemed to have great influence over him. At 14 he desired to enter the Navy, and a midshipman's warrant was procured by his brother Lawrence. Now he could see the world, and was happy at the prospect. All winter long the mother's heart ached as she thought of the separation, and finally, when his clothing had been taken on board of a British man of war, her affection triumphed, and the lad was kept in his Virginia home, kept for a great work. However disappointed he may have been, his mother's word was law. Those who learn to obey in youth learn also how to govern in later life. George went back to school to study arithmetic and land surveying. He was thorough in his work, and his record books, still preserved, are neat and exact. It is never strange that a boy who idolizes his mother should think other women lovable. At 15, the bashful, manly boy had given his heart to a girl about his own age, and it was long before he could conquer the affection. A year later he wrote to a friend, "I might, was my heart disengaged, pass my time very pleasantly, as there's a very agreeable young lady lives in the same house, but as that's only adding fuel to fire, it makes me the more uneasy, for by often and unavoidably being in company with her, revives my former passion for your lowland beauty. Whereas, was I to live more retired from young women, I might in some measure alleviate my sorrows, by burying that chaste and troublesome passion in the grave of oblivion." Years afterwards, the son of this lowland beauty, General Henry Lee, became a favorite with Washington in the Revolutionary War, possibly all the more loved from tender recollections of the mother. General Lee was the father of General Robert E. Lee of the Confederate Army in the Civil War. At 16, the real work of Washington's life began. Lord Fairfax of Virginia desired his large estates beyond the Blue Ridge to be surveyed, and he knew that the youth had the courage to meet the Indians in the wilderness and would do his work well. Washington and a friend set out on horseback for the valley called by the Indians Shenandoah, the Daughter of the Stars. He made a record daily of the beauty of the trees. Every refined soul loves trees almost as though they were human, and the richness of the soil, and selected the best sites for townships. In his diary he says, "A blowing rainy night. Our straw upon which we were lying took fire, but I was luckily preserved by one of our men awakening when it was in a flame." For 3 years he lived this exposed life, sleeping out of doors, gaining self-reliance, and a knowledge of the Indians, which knowledge he was soon to need. Trouble had begun already in the Ohio Valley, between the French and English, in their claims to the territory. No wonder a sachem asked, "The French claim all the land on one side of the Ohio, the English claim all the land on the other side. Now, where does the Indians' land lie?" Virginia began to make herself ready for a war which seemed inevitable. She divided her province into military districts, and placed one in charge of the young surveyor, only 19, who was made adjutant general with the rank of major. Thus early did the sincere, self-poised young man take upon himself great responsibilities. Washington at once began to make himself ready for his duties, by studying military tactics, taking lessons in field work from his brother Lawrence, and sword exercise from a soldier. This drill was broken in upon for a time by the illness and death of Lawrence, of whom he was very fond, and whom he accompanied to the Barbados. Here George took smallpox, from which he was slightly marked through life. The only child of Lawrence soon died, and Mount Vernon came to George by will. He was now a person of wealth, but riches did not spoil him. He did not seek ease, he sought work and honor. Matters were growing worse in the Ohio Valley. The Virginians had erected forts at which is now Pittsburgh, and the French about 15 miles south of Lake Erie. Governor Dinwiddie determined to make a last remonstrance with the French, who should thus presume to come upon English territory. The way to their forts lay through an unsettled wilderness, a distance of from 500 to 600 miles. Some Indian tribes favored one nation, some the other. The governor offered this dangerous commission, a visit to the French, to several persons, who hastened to decline with thanks of proffered honor. Young Washington, with his brave heart, was willing to undertake the journey, and started September 30, 1753, with horses, tents, and other necessary equipments. They found the rivers swollen, so that the horses had to swim. The swamps, in the snow and rain, were almost impassable. At last they arrived at the forts early in December. Washington delivered his letter to the French, and an answer was written to the governor. On December 25th, Washington and his little party started homeward. The horses were well nigh exhausted, and the men dismounted, put on Indian hunting dress, and toiled on through the deepening snow. Washington, in haste to reach the governor, strapped his pack on his shoulders, and, gun in hand, with one companion, Mr. Gist, struck through the woods, hoping thus to reach the Allegheny River sooner, and cross on the ice. At night they lit their campfire, but at 2 in the morning they pursued their journey, guided by the North Star. Some Indians now approached, and offered their services as guides. One was chosen, but Washington soon suspected that they were being guided in the wrong direction. They halted, and said they would camp for the night, but the Indian demurred, and offered to carry Washington's gun, as he was fatigued. This was declined, when the Indian grew sullen, hurried forward, and, when 15 paces ahead, leveled his gun and fired at Washington. Gist at once seized the savage, took his gun from him, and would have killed him on the spot had not the humane Washington prevented. He was sent home to his cabin with a loaf of bread, and told to come to them in the morning with meat. Probably he expected to return before morning, and, with some other braves, scalp the 2 Americans. But Washington and Gist traveled all night, and reached the Allegheny River opposite the site of Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, the river was not frozen as they had hoped, but was full of broken ice. All day long they worked to construct a raft, with but one hatchet between them. After reaching the middle of the river, the men on the raft were hurled into 10 feet of water by the floating ice, and Washington was saved from drowning only by clinging to a log. They lay till morning on an island in the river, their clothes stiff with frost, and the hands and feet of poor Gist frozen by the intense cold. The agony of that night Washington never forgot. even in the horrors of Valley Forge. Happily, the river had grown passable in the night, and they were able to cross to a place of safety. He came home as speedily as possible and delivered the letter to Governor Dinwiddie. His journal was sent to London and published, because of the knowledge it gave of the position of the French. The young soldier of 21 had escaped death from the burning straw in surveying, from the Indian's gun, and from drowning. He had shown